Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome to the Endgame version for my WitchHunter. In this guide I'll show you how to gear up for T15s, what stats to look for, some map sustain and progression tips, and some really nice tech to make the build zoom with bonus movement speed in a game where movement speed is really hard to come by. I'm also going to try and answer some of the questions I've received the most. If there's something that you are curious about, I'm happy to answer questions, just leave me a comment below. Yesterday I completed my atlas, and I wanted to try a bunch of content instead of putting out a video speculating, so here are the results. This is a T14 corrupted map, and I'll get into why I corrupted it in just a minute, but WitchHunter's Zealous Inquisition carries mapping so hard. You get big AoE with grenades, you get big AoE with corpse explosions, and everything dies. After experiencing the hardest maps, I've also come to realize that you need to hard prioritize defense or you won't make progress. So I've taken Sorcery Ward, and it feels amazing. In the upper left hand corner you can see I have effectively 6.2k life for all elemental hits, and there are a lot of them, particularly projectiles. I've stacked hybrid armor evasion because in a pure armor setup you need to soak every hit, paired with strong on hit or on block recovery to mitigate, which is where 50% evade for strikes and projectiles comes in big with evasion. I'm still using a similar skill rotation, but I've switched up a few supports to give some mana leech on flash grenades if I'm in a pinch, and I've 6-linked my gas grenades. You don't need to 6-link anything unless you really want to. I'm using level 17 gems here, nothing crazy, and my weapon isn't like a Giga Corrupted Fizz crossbow. It's a pretty normal one I got for 40 exalts. This is what my first T15 boss kill looked like. You can judge for yourself. Side note, one of the best things I ever did was change the exalt drop to be div-like. I'll put my filter in the description below. It's basically never sinks PoE2 light filter with a few modifications. Before we go any farther, the Mobalytics guide that I wrote has a few new features. Up at the top, you'll see progression tabs for A1, A2, A3 into early maps, and then a T15. This is completely new. Check it out if you're someone who'd rather just read something than watch a video on it. All right, so how exactly are we doing this? What does it look like? If you have a Radiant Grief, the helmet, all you need is to run around and throw gas grenades. Occasionally throw a flash grenade, or if you need to burst down something large like a rare, hit him with an oil grenade first and then a gas grenade. The ignite from the helmet will ignite both the oil and expose the enemy, and then the gas grenades will AoE shotgun on top of them. So there's a 1 button for most things and then a 2 button for big things. Flash grenade is great in a pinch or if you want to disorient a group of mobs before you run in, otherwise you don't need it. If you don't have a Radiant Grief, that's totally fine. What you're going to do instead is throw a gas grenade and then shoot it with explosive shot, which will pop the clouds and pop everything around it, including other gas grenades, so throwing a second volley is often a good idea. For larger rares and bosses, what you're going to do is throw an oil grenade and then shoot the oil grenade with an explosive shot, igniting the ground, and then throw a gas grenade on top of that. Note that you're not going to get an explosion from a gas grenade if you throw it onto burning oil. It has to be an ignited enemy, not just the oil. There's an important reason for this exact sequence, and I explain it in my previous video, which I'll link in the description below. One other mechanical thing, you'll notice that I am dodge rolling as soon as I throw grenades. This is because you can animation cancel out of the slow period as soon as you attack, and instead defer it until after you dodge roll, which I've found to be really nice. When you stand and shoot, often the mobs will target you, and you can see what that looks like right here. All right, back to the crossbow. This is mine. We're going to start there. So this is a pretty normal-ish crossbow for T15 maps. It rolls, I think, about 30% higher than this. If you wanted to spend a bunch of currency, I spent 40 exalts on this. The stats you want to prioritize are physical damage and flat physical damage. Those are by far the most important. I don't even have any flat on this. And it still works great in T15s. Increased elemental damage with attacks is another big roll. It rolls quite high. Some older PoE1 players might call this WED, but elemental damage with attacks, another big damage multiplier. For suffixes, the main thing that you want is attack speed. Some crit chances, okay. Some life leeches, also okay. Or some gain mana per enemy killed, also okay. Next, let's look at my hat. I'm still using a Radiant Grief. This thing is excellent. I highly recommend it. It's so much better than having to ignite the enemies yourselves. This is probably not something I would trade, but they're not super expensive, especially if you're in T15s. This is my body armor. It's an expert rogue armor. The implicit here gives you a bunch of life. I also want to prioritize life, res, and a lot of armor and evasion. This is the biggest piece of armor and evasion we're going to get in our whole build, and that will be key to you staying alive. Next is gloves. So these gloves are pure armor, and there is a very good reason for that. There is a notable called leather-bound gauntlets that gives you that gives you a ton of evasion based on how much armor is on your glove. So this is a synergy like Trickster had in PoE 1, and you absolutely want to take advantage of it. This pair of gloves gives me, I think, about 2600 armor just by himself, even with a 500 roll, because it pairs with another notable called General's Bindings, which gives us a percentage of our evasion pool as armor. For boots, you could go armor or armor evasion. I think either is fine, but I probably wouldn't do pure evasion. The number one stat you want on your boots is movement speed. It's the best by a lot. All the monsters in T15s are extremely fast, and you are not. So the more movement speed you had, the better you're going to be at staying alive. Of the handful of deaths I've had so far since getting to T15s, probably half could have been avoided if I was just slightly faster. For the rest, you want res, life, and defensive stats. I would make sure that you get a decent base here. I wouldn't get good rolls of movement speed on a bad base. A good base is going to be really important to make sure that you have enough armor and evasion. So if you have an open suffix, rarity is also great. Rarity affects your currency drops in PoE 2, unlike in PoE 1. So I have also thrown some rarity on every piece of gear where I had a free suffix. The belt here, base type, is important. So utility belt is the one I'm using. In my opinion, it's the best base type. It gives you 20% of flask effect applied instantly. This is an emergency button that you can press if you make a mistake and end up inside a pack of mobs and can't get out. The top racers use this. You should definitely be using this. It feels very good for it to be there when you need it. For the flasks themselves, you can either go for instant recovery or you can get more recovered, which I have on my life flask. And then I think the best suffix by far is charges gained over time. If you end up in a fight where you've used all your charges, they will slowly regenerate. And sometimes that one extra use will be the difference maker. My belt is the same story. You want res, you want life. Belts can roll armor, flat armor. So I have flat armor on my belt. For rings, the story is similar. You want res, you want life. A couple other stats that can roll on rings that are nice are gain mana per enemy killed. That will help you keep mana up during maps. And also keep in mind you can catalyst jewelry, so this will give you an additional up to 20% more of whatever the stat you're looking for. Also keep in mind, if you have an open suffix, rarity is amazing. It will improve your currency drops considerably. For amulets, just like rings, however, you can anoint an amulet, and the anoint I've gone with here is Step Like Mist. Step Like Mist gives us 4% movement speed, some mana regen, which is also really nice, and some dex int, which helps us with our supports. On top of that, it doesn't cost a lot. Some of the anoints are wildly expensive, and this is, I think it cost me about 10 exalts. Lastly, there is this, Death Rush. Death Rush is a PoE 1 unique, and it has made a return, and I think this is one of the strongest uniques in Path of Exile 2. Movement speed is extremely scarce. This ring gives Onslaught, which is 10% movement speed and 20% skill speed. Skill speed is new, but it's sort of like action speed. It only affects your attack and cast speed though, but still reduces our attack time by about 0.2 seconds. Now I also have to say this is not mandatory. This is just a quality of life, nice to have thing. I went and got as much res as I could on the other pieces of gear so that I could put this on, because man, movement speed is really, really hard to come by. And I didn't want to path all the way into Ranger because you lose so much power doing that. And even if you're focused on doing bosses, you're still going to have to map like 95% of the time, because everything you do is a map. To go from one boss to the next, map. So there's a ton of value in making those maps faster. And more than that, movement speed, because of how fast all the mobs are, will save your life. For runes, I would prioritize ones that give you armor and evasion in your chest and your gloves, especially in your gloves because of how valuable armor is in that slot. And then I took chaos res everywhere else. I'm not chaos res capped yet, and that has killed me a few times. And chaos damage is everywhere, so I keep a chaos charm basically on all the time. I also keep a varied selection of charms in my inventory because sometimes maps will roll bleed or they'll roll poison. And then once I chaos res cap, I'm going to go back to this gold charm, which gives me more rarity. If I had to choose a next priority to upgrade in the gear that I have, I would get a better crossbow. My crossbow is okay, it works great for T15s. I've done +3 boss levels with it on T15 maps, but there's a lot of headroom for a better piece of gear here. A word of caution when you're gearing up for late maps, and this is true for any character in the game's current state, it's not like campaign where you can get away with not res capping or really scuffed gear. If you've seen any of the clips of people ripping the pass fail mechanics or missing a dodge, you'll know exactly what I mean. Your gear is very important. Let's start the passive tree with our Ascendency. So I have taken all the way up to Ceremonial Ablution, above Obsessive Rituals. Sorcery Ward is incredible. And defense is the name of the game in T15 maps. So I took these, and I'm also using Zealous Inquisition because 95% of the time we are mapping. Literally, to get to the bosses, you have to do a map. So it's no more the I can just spam bosses like you could in Path of Exile 1. You need good mapping capability, and Zealous Inquisition is an exceptional mapping tool. It's probably the best mapping tool of any Ascendancy. The way I'd prioritize these is Zealous Inquisition first, and then Obsessive Rituals, and then Ceremonial Ablution. I'm going to get Culling Strike again as soon as I finish lab. I also have some really interesting ideas for Weapon Master and some uniques and some interactions that will make Cold Conversion really pop. I'm going to save those for another video though. Looking at the passive tree, there's a mix of cooldown recovery rate, AoE to enable AoE shotgunning, attack damage, some Ellie pen, and a lot of defense. A ton of armor evasion hybrid nodes are really useful. Leatherbound gauntlets down here is probably the best defensive node we have, especially if you get a good pair of gloves. Pair that with General's Binding and a decent evasion pool, and my 500 armor gloves turn into 2600 armor. Taking a look at my character sheet, you see I have 5500 armor and 4500 evasion. I think a mix here is best. I have gone harder into armor and it just didn't feel as good. Evasion is really, really strong as a defensive layer. If you're only taking half as many projectile and melee strikes, it adds up really fast, especially with your sorcery ward only taking about 4 seconds to fully recharge to 4500. Now I've spent a ton of time tinkering with this just to make the defenses feel right. I have pathed over to Unnatural Resilience and played with some of the max res stuff here, but the reality is that with Sorcery Ward, we're actually strongest against elemental hits. Dots are a slightly different thing, but pathing over here with 8 passive points just doesn't feel worth it to me for the max res that we get. I've also pathed over to Blade Catcher and Polished Iron, which are both great, especially Blade Catcher since we have our armor. There's a lot of armor, especially from Sturdy Metal, which comes from our body armor, over on the warrior side of the tree. There's a write-up and a full passive tree that you can scan around and look at Mobilytics. That will be the most up-to-date place to look at the tree. I update it every time I touch this character, and the link will be in the description below. The skill setup is pretty straightforward. We are primarily a grenade build, so gas grenades socketed with Scatter Shot, Immolate, Elemental Focus, Fire Infusion, and Primal Armament is the 6-link setup I have right now. Oil Grenade for bosses is excellent, slows them. Strip Away will buff the exposure that it inflicts. Persistence makes it last longer, and Encumbrance further slows the enemy. Flash Grenade is excellent utility, it will stun things. You can use Overpower, however I wouldn't recommend it because the more stun is additive with the 400% more on the card. Brutality is a great choice instead. More physical damage, that's what we want. Soul Thief is excellent. If you get into a tight spot with mana, you can throw a couple flash grenades and you'll proc Mana Leech and Maim for, again, further slowing. My aura setup's pretty simple. I'm running Herald of Ash with Clarity and Wind Dancer with Cannibalism. Cannibalism was a suggestion from the last video. It works out great. And Clarity because mana is something that we always have to solve for. All right, now at the beginning of the video, I promised that I would offer some advice about map progression and pursuing your Atlas. It's not super obvious what you're supposed to do here if you've never touched something like this before. It's not even super obvious if you're really good at it in PoE 1. Let's start with the Atlas tree. Those are sort of the biggest levers that we have to pull. The first thing I'll say is you need to prioritize higher tier waystones. Now, once you've done that, you need to prioritize making your content as hard as possible. GGG has a long history of making hard content rewarding. So you need to transmute and augment your maps. You need to regal your maps. If you can, you need to val them. I started regaling and valing my maps around tier 5. This gave me more loot because there's a chance that you can roll more modifiers on there. The more modifiers, the more loot. Also, the harder the content, but importantly, the more loot. Now, the next thing I'm going to say is you want to put your very best, highest percentage waystone drop maps on bosses. Once you figure out the towers and tablets, you can also irradiate maps, which will again give them +1. Here's a great example in my Atlas of what I'm talking about. You can see this tower right here. I used an irradiated tablet on it, and you can transmute and augment these. You can't do anything more than that, but make sure that you do that. Put it in here after you complete it, and it will give some number of maps this symbol. This symbol right here, irradiated, will give it +1 level. Now the goal is to have +1 level with a map boss, like here. And you want to run your best maps in these spots. There's one other symbol, it's a corruption, it's red, it has flames on it, looks like this, that does basically the same thing, but it'll also spawn beyond. Sometimes the map mods will be a little weird, like reduced rarity, I guess because it's a corruption. There's a lot of that to go into. I don't want to do it all right here. I'm going to make another video later and I'll go into it in more detail there. All right, that's all I have for now. I have another update planned once I push into pinnacle bosses. But for now, this has been a super smooth T15 blaster. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Check out the Mobalytics guide. I'll keep it up to date as possible. That will be the place for the most up to date stuff. Take care.